or just dates or raisins. Those are the only sweeteners that I use, and they can make me the sweetest loaf of bread that we've ever had. And they do work well with extended fermentations. Because sometimes if you actually put sugar in your bread as part of it, it has more method in it. And this one, the first book here, it uses 1/8 of a teaspoon of yeast for basically all of the loaves of bread.
This one?
That one, the one in the left hand. And the second book, though, I go through the methodology because the first book I wrote in 2012. And so I figured, you know, a lot of the bread I make isn't quite like the first book anymore, even though it's perfectly valid for when you're doing an overnight loaf of bread. So sometimes, though, I wake up and I go, oh, I needed to make that sourdough loaf, or I'm making pizza for dinner, I need to make a sourdough pizza dough. And so instead of using 1/8 of a teaspoon and just eating dinner late, I use 1/4 of a teaspoon. And then we're using 1/4 of a teaspoon, instead of it being a 12-hour fermentation using twice as much yeast, it's only going to be about a 7-hour fermentation, which works out perfect for right when I want to make pizza. So that's the other way you can use instant yeast. It gives you reproducible results. Since you don't have to activate it, you can just put it in there. If you start to meter that amount of yeast that you use, that's how you can get bread when you want to have bread. It just takes a little bit of forethought to think about when you want to have the bread, and just by the amount of yeast that you use, it'll be ready when you want to bake it and eat it fresh, because fresh bread is the best bread you have. Although the bread does keep, you know, in an airtight container, one of these loaves is still going to be nice after 3 days, and it makes great toast anyways, but sourdough bread. So, but if I'm normal, since it's long fermentation, the one other thing that I do is I don't deflate the loaf after a couple hours and then let it rise again, because since I give it such a long time to rise, the gluten will form. Gluten will form naturally over time, and you can just see that when you go to take your dough out, you can just see the strands of gluten. So I don't perform a second rise.
Okay.
If I'll make the dough, and the same way, and for that same reason, I wouldn't take a 4-cup ball of dough and cut it in half to make 2 loaves, because it's going to start to deflate, and then you would have to let it rise again. So I always make all of my bread in separate containers if I'm going to bake 2 loaves. Just to tell you how we used to run what we call the bread club, where my wife works, and at one point in time I had 8 2SP2s, 4 on each shelf in my oven, and I'd make 8 loaves of bread at one time, because I was baking. If they were having a craft fair at my wife's job, I'd bake 32 loaves of bread. 5 minutes, they were gone. But I would do that by, these loaves of bread here, I had, this one is in a loaf pan, so it went separately. These 3 loaves, though, I had 3 2SP2s in the oven. So you can have, if you're using just one, my kids are home, and we're baking bread. I'll make a chocolate bread in this. And once you take the lids off, then you can leave one in the oven a little longer. You're just watching the crust till it gets to the way you want it. But
what did you bake that particular loaf that's there in?
The small one.
The small one?
This one right here,
I came in late,
it's still in the oven.
Gotcha, okay.
Heating up so I can make the raisin bread.
So you were talking about the yeast, and you only use anywhere from 1/4 to 1/8 of a
Yes.
teaspoon. If you prefer more yeast, is that acceptable in with these recipes or not?
No, in these it is, but the fermentation time is definitely going to be different.
Right.
But yeah, you can use however much yeast you want,
Okay.
and just be aware that your fermentation time is going to differ from what is listed.
Okay.
And which are these? Again, I came in late, so I don't know what you baked here.
Oh,
I tried some fennel something.
Oh, yeah, this was it's Fennel Semolina.
Okay.
And basically, fennel, a lot of people think it's going to taste like licorice. But if I soak the seed for 8 to 10 hours first, and that mellows it out, and it just gives you more of a spicy flavor. And then I also put some semolina flour, which is the flour that they make pasta. And it gives it a tighter crumb. So if you want to make something like, you can make garlic bread with that, or you could, if you want to use it for an hors d'oeuvre or a canapé, if you just, this one person in the bread club loved the jalapeno bread. And this person could sit down, eat the entire loaf with a bottle of ranch dressing. That's going a little too far for me. I just like the jalapeno bread as it is. It's pickled jalapenos, and that adds that extra salty and spicy flavor to it. It's a great loaf. And again, like, this is the chocolate bread, and you can use Dutch cocoa, you can use standard cocoa, and then just half a cup of raisins. Half a cup of raisins chopped is enough to sweeten
Chocolate powder.
the cocoa powder. It's great.
Now, I know you said this was for another time, but
Yes.
I'll be cooking in an RV, so what could you advise to get me started?
You know,
A 2-quart?
yes, I was going to say you're definitely going to be limited by your oven size. 2 quart is fine, and like I say, this is the black pepper bread. It gives you a nice smaller loaf. Black pepper's sort of a unique spice. Some of the other spices used in Indian cooking, they have antimicrobial qualities, which is why spices are used. Black pepper is that way too. And if I would have had another loaf here, you'd see that the black pepper bread is smaller than the other loaves because I put a whole teaspoon of black pepper, freshly ground black pepper in there. And the black pepper bread, by the way, was the best-selling loaf in the bread club. They loved the black pepper, the pickled jalapeno, and the chocolate bread were the 3 best-selling loaves.
And which of your books is that in? Are the recipes
That is in
different
different
books?
books.
Different books? Oh no. Okay,
Right.
that one. Okay.
Black pepper.
Yes.
You added in and it changed the crumb of the bread.
I
So
don't
like
need to look at
when you're using all-purpose versus bread flour.
I didn't hit on that point, and I wanted to. Especially, yes, especially during the pandemic, the question is using all-purpose flour. Okay, I do specifically use 4 bread flour when I make bread because it does have. If you read the labels, all-purpose flour, it'll say there's 3 grams of protein in 30 grams serving, and it'll say that also on the bread flour. Some of the bread flour will say 3 and 30. But don't confuse the amount of protein listed for the flour with the amount of gluten in the bread, because gluten is only one of the proteins in flour. And bread flour has more gluten in it, and bread flour will therefore take more water when you're mixing the dough. So if you're going to try to use all-purpose dough with any of these recipes, you're going to have to use at least 1/3 less water. But the reason why I don't use all-purpose flour, unless it's the only thing on the shelf, is that I don't like the flavor of bread with all-purpose flour. I got to be desperate to make bread with all-purpose flour. The extra gluten, it's that protein that gives the bread part of its flavor and also its texture. For me, all-purpose flour, it's too granular, too light, and kind of bland, or it tastes more like a cracker. If I want to make a cracker, I'll use all-purpose flour. But yeah.
When you're doing that, do you measure out in a measuring cup or do you weigh it?
No, I always, in all of these, I only have one friend who likes to measure things out. And that's why in the new book, the part 2 book, I do put the weight of flour that I use. But I'm all for just, and this is better than my grandmother. It was just a couple of handfuls of this, and a little bit of water and like that. the way Grandma did. But I use, I list all the measuring, everything is the measuring cups, measuring spoons, but the part 2 book has the weights in grams of all of the ingredients too. Because I succumb to what my friend says. Okay, I'll do it. I'll weigh everything that is used. So people who like to weigh can weigh. But the problem I have with weighing, being a chemist, is the fact that I don't have a machine to determine the level of moisture in the flour to begin with. And so without knowing that, I just figured it's a lot easier to just take a couple of tablespoons rather, of your water out beforehand. Because you, like I said, you can add water to the dough, but you can't take water out. So that's the way it's a good question.
You don't deflate the bread, so when you let it rise against those, it's basically take it out carefully and plug it back to whatever it is. How do you do that?
This is raisin.
I think the one.
Sorry.
Yes. You can make it as round or not as you want. All you have to do is push in underneath it.
So is that essentially ready to drop in here?
Yeah, and that's one option.
So you don't have to put any flour or anything on it.
They'll roll right out.
Remember to put my real gloves on because it's not fun to grab.
And I use that pastry cutter or turner a lot.
I already baked the loaf, which is why it's really small.
Oh, so he heats the pan first?
Yes.
Okay.
Nope, it's the cast iron is pre-seasoned. I do not put any additional flour in there. I don't use the cooking spray.
That's good.
You make that light.
Around 8.
Prepares it at 6 o'clock at night,
And he only uses about an eighth of a teaspoon of yeast, not what it's calling in the recipe, because he does what's called extended fermentation. So it takes less yeast, which our bodies actually appreciate.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
So it just cures longer.
Thank you.
It ferments
See, I
longer.
missed the first 15 minutes, so I'm like, okay, what did I miss?
Those were the key points I took away.
Okay.
I'm sure there were more, but
I appreciate you sharing.
my
Thank
brain
you.
could only hold so much.
That's her test.
Yeah.
See, that's why I go back and look at my videos, so I can go back and say, okay, now he
This
didn't
is
say
a
this.
number.
Okay.
It's 5.
Interesting.
But it's called the number 8.
I have all these cast irons
This is
in my
for
house,
when
and I'm like, I need to
I
start
will
using
use
it. Okay.
You're blessed, honey. You got it.
Four
That's awesome.
loaves of bread here.
That's awesome.
If I want to make open face or just dinner rolls, open face rolls, like when I make sloppy joes, I'll use.
See, I'd love to have those corn sticks right there.
Any of those
That
type
would
of
remind
recipes.
me
Like,
of
I would
Downey's
take
barbecue.
that loaf, the dough from the
Cornbread
black
and
pepper
those.
bread, and with the dough knife.
I feel like if I use pan and stuff, it leaves a sticky residue sometimes.
Yes.
But if I use just 100% oil with a propellant in it, I don't get that same
And
effect.
this is why.
Yeah.
It's if you read the label, as I always do, it will say soy lecithin.
Yes.
Soy lecithin, I don't know if you've ever seen it in a jar.
No.
It pours thicker than
Melted
blackstrap
rubber.
molasses. It's thick. It's thick, it's gummy. It will stick to, if you get it on you, you're going to have a devil of a time getting it off.
Okay.
But it does dissolve in water.
Oh.
And
I'm not taking a picture, I'm just videoing.
Well,
So you-
emulsification is mixing two substances together that don't normally mix, oil and water.
Yeah.
And
So
that's why
what
it's
that
used in
does.
here. But yeah, if you grease any of your cast iron with pure olive oil, pure coconut
Yeah,
oil,
that's
canola
what I do.
oil,
Yeah.
because it will leave a residue that builds up on your cast iron.
Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Active yeast, even though it's not active, you have to activate it. It's larger granules, and that's why you dissolve it to break down those granules in the sugar solution, and then it starts to activate. Instant yeast is more finely ground. It's meant to be blended in with all the other dry ingredients, and once it gets wet, then the yeast will start to become active.
And so when you're doing 12-hour rising,
Yes.
it's just on your counter?
Yes, it is all just sitting out. We have a sunroom, it's called, in our house, and that's where I do all the bread rising.
Oh, that must be nice and warm. I actually lucked out in our heat bill.
All the French bread pan, and Lodge actually used to make one a long time ago, and one of my goals in doing these bread shows here at Lodge is to try to get Lodge to make more baking pans.
Okay.
And we need more pans like this.
Wow, that's the first time I've seen one like that. Yeah.
Yeah, this one's old, and it has what they're called bottom gate marks. So this is more than likely a 19th century pan, made in like after 1870 to 1890. So.
Wow. And these are what, breadsticks or something?
Yeah, these are breadstick pans, and these are old Lodge. These were probably made in the 50s or the 60s. And if it looks more familiar like this, you'll see 11-stick corn pans. But I like to make even numbers, and I can't cut dough into 11 pieces. So I use 2 6-stick pans.
So these are not even offered then?
No, yeah, this one's not, and they don't, but I wanted to bring other cast iron, just because well, my books have evaporated, but in the second book, I use these pans just to show what you can do.
Okay.
But for breadsticks, you can use this same pan. This is the pan that I make the focaccia in. And you can also make a pizza in it if you want. Personally, I use the focaccia dough, and I will put it in the number 17 skillet they have here. That's my pizza pan.
Okay.
I love making pizza in that pizza pan. But instead of the breadstick pan, you can put the individual breadsticks on this pan. So you can still make any recipe in the second book with the Lodge, the current releases for Lodge's cast iron. That's sort of what I was trying to bring in.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's for the camped oven there.
You know, I think the bread, because this has it's flat, rather flat, and it dips down 3/8 of an inch. I'm not sure that's gonna work. Because you do need.
So you should take measuring. That's still going to meet the height requirement.
You see that one? This one, it just makes it, but by the time it gets to that height, I'm pulling the lid off and it's finishing.
Now, I get what they mean.
Yeah.
It's great input. But as far as temperature, I've experienced with just regular cooking, I'm having to learn to adjust my temperature.
Yeah, it can. The good thing though, when you're baking with cast iron, is the cast iron is pretty much going to do the baking part. You're just using the oven to heat the iron up. And once when you leave this in the oven for at least 10 minutes, heating up at say 485 degrees, the cast iron is going to hold that temperature, and that's what's going to cradle the bread and get the jump and help it to rise. Yeah, the times might differ.
So she's from Hungary. She's from Hungary, so this is her husband who bakes all the bread. Oh my gosh. So she was explaining, I was asking, but she said something about a bread club, and she said he had a husband bake all the bread.
And then it's the second one where you're uncovered.
So he's been doing this such a long time, right?
I think the first book came out like 2004 or 5. And he's been doing it before. We lived in the Silicon Valley, in close to San Francisco. And we moved to the East Coast in 2008.
Okay.
So he started before he actually, because he has a chemist background, he started his own sourdough culture because sourdough is so famous in San Francisco. And we always thought, one of our kids may be going to be a microbiologist and can use this tool as a project to write a thesis, but neither of them went to that direction. But we have a sourdough culture, and then they moved us cross country. We couldn't fly because liquid cannot be transferred. So we were driving cross country because of the sourdough culture.
So are you guys here in North Carolina now?
In Chapel Hill. Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill.
Okay.
It's 2 hours from here.
2 hours from here. Okay, gotcha.
So close to Raleigh. It's,
Raleigh. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, there's a Chapel Hill, Durham, and Raleigh. That's the triangle. They got to take all, and there's lots of multinational companies have a presence there. But we live in Chapel Hill.
So you said national company. So are you with a particular company now?
No, a multinational company, BASF. It's a big chemical biological company. They have different things, but I'm in agriculture.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, all right.
Specifically in a camp oven, I do use different coal counts than what you will find in just generic Dutch oven books. Because if you read a 450 degree and it says to use 12 coals on the bottom and 22 coals on the top, I found that the way bread bakes, if you want your bread to bake on top to look just like that loaf, you actually need a couple more coals. And for underneath, all of the heat when you're cooking with a camp oven, all the heat, it just channels up. And so if you're too hot on the bottom, it's going to burn. So I always use the next temperature step down, like the 400 degree coal mark, to do the bread in the bottom. I can make bread in a camp oven, it'll look just like
campers?
that.
No, well, we do outdoor cooking demonstrations and whatnot, so yeah, we use fire.
Oh, and where do you do that at?
At the Renaissance Festival.
Oh, really? Okay.
And really, we're doing wood, so we're just guessing. We're just putting it in
I look at the volume and just how solid the coals are, because it depends, on because I do a lot of the fire management, so it depends on the wood, it depends on how well it coals, and then at that point,
Have you ever used an infrared laser thing?
Yes.
And so if your coals are anywhere in the vicinity of 650 to 850 degrees, that's where you can. That's your wood, if you're using hardwood coals.
Right.
And those are the ones you can use in like 11 of those on the bottom.
We are trying to do a period, so we hide it and
With the temperature shift, how the yeast behaves using instant yeast, we would stick to the formula of using a small amount to allow for ferment, because that chemically it makes more sense. I did chemistry. I'm in chemistry. So the question is, would that affect having to then, because it's going to be a different to govern temperature, it's going to be cooking at a higher temperature. Is there something that we need to look out for, or just how long we would let the yeast actually ferment? Just depending on would it change how it behaves?
There's going to be a minimum time when you're just using an eighth of a teaspoon. It's going to be 10 to 14 hours. It's going to depend on ambient temperature.
Right, because that affects a lot, because we're outdoors. So it starts like the beginning of the season is kind of warm, gets really cold. We have to also account for wind, because that changes how the temperature around the oven is too.
Which is why on a camp oven, I always recommend using a windscreen.
That one right there.
And that's a friend of mine who lives up in Raleigh. He gave me the windscreen, because I had the problem when I would light the coals for the camp oven. The wind would come along and it would blow it up. You put a windscreen around it, you no longer have to worry about that.
We'll have to figure out how to make.
Right now we're doing, we have a rock bed, and then we have, it's literally like a rock circle with a fire.
Right, and
we're trying to build this year a raised bed, So that might give us the opportunity.
That might give us an opportunity to do that, but really the way I was kind of controlling how the wind would blow is like you saw, we have a large cast iron cauldron that we just heat water in for washing too. I was keeping the coals for like when we were doing the quiche against that, so that way like I can kind of figure out, like, you know, I knew if the wind was blowing this way, then I have this backing it. You know, so that was.
We try to protect it with other stuff.
In a number 12 camp oven, I'll have 11 coals underneath it, and I have a windscreen going around it. And it was, I wish I could remember. They actually want to have me back in October, so I might be able to do some camp oven.
We can't.
That's when we're doing it.
No!
Come down to where we are. We're right around. We're just down the street.
I'm up in Chapel Hill.
Oh, no. We can't do that one.
Do you do these? I got your card. I'm going to give you one too. Do you do these demonstrations all over the state?
I do not, because I just don't really know where. But I've been after her to have me do these at the other lodge factory stores.
We don't have a store in Georgia.
Oh, really?
I just came from Tennessee. You guys have
She was the store in
Yeah.
Georgia.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
That's why I'm here. We closed it 4 years ago.
Wow.
And opened here 3 years ago.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, sure did.
I went to the Georgia store. My family has read.
Oh, look at that. You just took it out.
This one.
Hungarian bread.
I saw that recipe. It looks delicious.
Which is something I will be attempting to do a little bit later. But I have tried to bake a 1 cup, and it just raises too high for the one. I think you'd have to use more like 3/4 of a cup of flour, and that would go in the 1/4 Dutch oven. But it would make a really great split pea soup bowl if you did something like that. But yeah, I think it would raise a little bit too high, because even though it's a concave lid on that, just like this one, it's still pops up a little bit too high. Yeah. It's like if you're baking bread in the camp oven, which are the ones that have 3 legs on the bottom, you can't just use a standard number 8 camp oven. You have to get or number 10. You have to get the deep camp oven, because the bread just rises a little bit too high. About 30 seconds, really. Doesn't. Not gonna hurt you. Dry ingredients left. And it may look a little bit dry. If it immediately starts to get too wet, you're gonna have to either add a little more flour or know next time that you need to reserve a couple of tablespoons before you do it. Dry ingredients left. And it may look a little bit dry. If it immediately starts to get too wet, you're gonna have to either add a little more flour or know next time that you need to reserve a couple of tablespoons before you do it. 10 minutes. And that's done.
Okay.
And you can see it's not.
And then you said 10 to 12 hours?
Yep, and now this, well, I put, okay, if you use 1/8 of a teaspoon, 10 to 12 hours. If it, well, for your rye culture, 10 to 12 hours. Since I just used instant yeast for this one, I will let it go for 12 to 14 hours.
I see.
But
Okay.
on this one, I used, because I'm mixing it up here today, I used 1/4 of a teaspoon of instant yeast. So this I'll bake at about 7 o'clock tonight.
Tonight?
Yeah.
Okay, so you used half.
Yes.